Ellie watched her parents' car disappear down the long, snow-covered driveway, the taillights fading into the white abyss. The world outside was silent, except for the soft hiss of falling snow. She turned to face the house, a looming Victorian relic, with dark gables, tall windows, and a tower that seemed to scrape the heavy gray sky. She'd always thought the house was a little too big for their family, a little too isolated. Now, with her parents gone for the weekend, the house felt more like a mausoleum than a home. "All right, Ellie," she muttered to herself, rubbing her arms against the cold that seemed to seep through the walls. "You've got this. 2 days. Easy." The first thing she noticed when she stepped inside was the quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press against her ears. The old floorboards groaned under her sneakers as she walked through the front hall, flicking on lights as she went. The chandelier above barely brightened the space, casting long, jagged shadows against the patterned wallpaper. Ellie went through the usual checklist. Doors locked, windows latched, thermostat cranked up. She told herself the tension in her chest was just nerves. Being alone in a house this size would make anyone jumpy. At least, that's what she wanted to believe. After heating up a cup of instant noodles, she wandered into the living room. It was a room she rarely used. Her parents liked to keep it formal, with antique furniture and a large fireplace they never lit. The shelves were lined with books and old knickknacks, things that had belonged to the house's previous owners. That's when she spotted the scrapbook. It sat on the coffee table, a heavy, leather-bound thing with a cracked spine and brass corner fittings. Ellie hadn't noticed it before. She sat down, pulling the book closer, curiosity outweighing her unease. The first few pages were harmless enough, sepia-toned photos of smiling families in stiff clothing, the kind you'd expect from the early 1900s. But as she flipped through, something started to feel off. In one photo, a family stood on the porch. The parents were in the center, 2 children at their sides, but there was something in the background, a faint smudge, like a shadow. At first, Ellie thought it was a flaw in the photograph, but as she turned the pages, she saw it again. And again. A wedding photo, with the same shadow lurking near the edge of the frame. A picnic scene, where it stood by the tree line, a Christmas gathering, with the shadow behind the curtains. Ellie closed the scrapbook with a snap, her fingers trembling. "Just an old book," she whispered. "That's all." But the images lingered in her mind, unsettling and stubborn. That night, Ellie settled into her room. The bed was warm, the blankets heavy, and she told herself everything was fine. But the house didn't let her rest. It started with a faint tapping on the window, a soft, irregular sound like fingertips brushing against the glass. She sat up, staring at the frost-covered panes, but there was nothing outside, except swirling snow. Then came the creaking. Long, drawn-out groans from the floorboards above her. Ellie clutched her blanket tighter. "It's just the house," she told herself, her voice barely audible. "Old houses make noises." But deep down, she knew better. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, until sleep finally claimed her, though her dreams were restless, filled with shadows that watched from the corners of every room. The next morning, Ellie woke to a house that felt different, as though it had been holding its breath while she slept. The winter light filtering through the curtains was pale and cold, giving the house an almost ethereal glow. She made herself a cup of coffee, her eyes wandering to the scrapbook still sitting on the living room table. She hesitated for a moment before flipping it open again. Something about the photos gnawed at her. A story half told, a mystery waiting to be uncovered. As she turned the brittle pages, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Tucked between 2 photographs was a yellowed newspaper clipping. She unfolded it carefully, the paper fragile and worn, and began to read. "Local boy missing after storm." The headline screamed at her in bold black letters. The article told of a boy named Samuel who had vanished from the house in 1953. He was last seen playing in the yard, his red kite tangled in the tree branches. No body was ever found, and his disappearance remained unsolved. Ellie's stomach churned as she noticed the photo accompanying the article. A smiling boy standing in front of the house, his kite in hand. But just like in the other photos, the faint shadow lingered in the background, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. As she continued to sift through the scrapbook, Ellie found more clippings, each more disturbing than the last. Another headline read, "Family disappears overnight, no clues left behind." A chilling account of a mother, father, and their 2 children who had seemingly vanished, leaving a fully set dinner table and no signs of a struggle. Her unease deepened. She closed the scrapbook, shoving it away as though it might bite her. She tried to shake off the growing dread, but the house refused to let her. It started with small things. A chair in the kitchen was slightly out of place, angled just enough to catch her attention. Ellie shrugged it off at first, thinking she might have moved it without realizing. Then she noticed the photo on the mantel, one of her parents taken last Christmas. It was tilted just enough to feel wrong. She straightened it, her fingers trembling slightly, and turned away. But when she glanced back, the frame was tilted again. "Okay, stop it," she muttered, her voice echoing in the empty room. She wasn't sure if she was talking to herself or something else. Later that afternoon, while wandering the house, Ellie noticed a door she'd never paid much attention to before. It was in the upstairs hallway, nestled between the guest room and her parents' bedroom. The door was painted a pale green, a color that didn't match any of the others in the house. Something about it prickled at her, like a mosquito bite she couldn't ignore. She reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. Ellie frowned, jiggling the handle harder. "What the hell?" she muttered. Her parents had never mentioned a locked door. In fact, she couldn't remember ever seeing anyone go in or out of that room. Her curiosity burned, but she decided to leave it alone for now. Still, as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the door was watching her, its pale green surface almost pulsing in the dim light of the hallway. That night, as she sat in the living room, the sensation of being watched returned, stronger now. She glanced over her shoulder and froze. The photo frame on the mantel was tilted again. That evening, Ellie sat cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through her phone to distract herself. The house had grown colder, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. She tried to convince herself it was just the drafty old windows, but deep down, she felt something else, something watching. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was a text message. The screen lit up with her mother's name. "Mom, are you okay, sweetheart?" Ellie blinked, her thumb hovering over the reply button. Her parents had told her they wouldn't have service in the remote area they were visiting. She hesitated, then typed, "Ellie? Yeah, I'm fine. Thought you wouldn't have service?" The reply came almost instantly. "Mom, we got a signal for a moment. Everything okay at home?" Something about the tone felt off. Her mother never texted like that. Before Ellie could respond, another message came through. "Mom, he's waiting." Her breath caught. "Ellie." "What?" No reply. She stared at the screen, willing it to light up again, but it remained stubbornly dark. A chill prickled at her skin. She told herself it was probably a prank or a glitch, but the pit in her stomach said otherwise. That's when the noises started. A low, rhythmic dragging sound came from upstairs, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Ellie's heart pounded as she froze, her ears straining. It stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Then faint whispers began to filter through the hall. They weren't words she could make out, just a soft, indecipherable murmur that seemed to move closer, then further away. The air grew colder. Ellie could see her breath fogging in front of her, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She stood, every nerve screaming for her to run, but her legs felt heavy, rooted in place. "I'm not going crazy," she whispered to herself, trying to summon courage from somewhere. She grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made her way to the study, her hands trembling. The study was dusty, cluttered with old books and antiques her parents had collected. Ellie opened drawers one by one, her mind racing. She was about to give up when her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic at the back of the desk. A skeleton key. She held it up to the light, its ornate design glinting faintly. Without hesitation, because hesitation would mean fear, and fear was unbearable, she marched to the locked door in the upstairs hallway. The key slid into the lock easily, almost too easily, as though it had been waiting for her. The door creaked open, revealing a room that smelled of dust and decay. Her flashlight swept over the space. The room was small and cluttered, filled with objects that didn't belong to her family. Toys, wooden blocks, a rusted tin soldier, a faded stuffed bear were strewn across the floor. A rocking horse sat in the center of the room, its paint chipped and one of its handles missing. It swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. On the walls hung black and white photographs, their frames crooked. Ellie stepped closer, her heart hammering as she studied them. The photos showed children, their expressions blank and lifeless, as if they had been posed by someone who didn't know what joy looked like. In the corner of each photo, she saw it again, the shadow. And then, from somewhere deeper in the house, she heard it. A laugh, soft, high-pitched, and unmistakably childlike. The night descended with a heaviness that felt unnatural, as if the darkness itself had weight. Ellie locked herself in her room, her flashlight clutched tightly in one hand and her phone in the other. The room felt colder than before, the shadows deeper, more alive. She stared at the locked door, her pulse quickening with every creak and groan of the old house. The laugh came again, faint but distinct, echoing through the hall. Her fingers tightened around the flashlight. "It's not real," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not real." But it was real. The laugh grew louder, accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps. No, not footsteps. It was a dragging sound, like claws scraping across the floorboards. Ellie's breath hitched as the sound stopped just outside her door. The knob rattled, slow and deliberate, as though whatever was on the other side was testing her resolve. She took a step back, her legs trembling. The door creaked open, though she'd locked it. She froze as a shadow spilled into the room, impossibly dark and formless. Two glowing eyes emerged from the void, locking onto her with an intensity that froze the air in her lungs. "Who? What are you?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. It moved, jerky and unnatural, its claw-like hands extending toward her. Ellie screamed and bolted for the opposite corner of the room, her flashlight beam flickering as it swept across the entity. It disappeared, only to reappear inches from her face, the glowing eyes filled with malice. She stumbled back, hitting the dresser hard enough to knock over a lamp. The shadow's claws slashed at the air, narrowly missing her. It didn't attack outright. It was playing with her, toying with her terror. Ellie darted around it, her adrenaline driving her toward the door. She made it into the hallway, but the creature was faster. It reappeared ahead of her, blocking her path, its form twisting and writhing as if it couldn't decide what shape to take. Ellie turned and ran the other way, down the stairs and into the living room, her breaths ragged and desperate. The rocking horse in the locked room was now in the center of the living room, swaying gently. Her flashlight beam trembled as it landed on the horse. She turned sharply, running back upstairs, the entity's claws scraping the walls behind her. She barely made it into her room, slamming the door shut and throwing herself against it. Her hands worked frantically to slide her desk in front of the door, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The rattling stopped, but the laughter resumed, soft, mocking, and just on the other side of the door. Ellie collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. As her hands brushed the floorboards, something odd caught her attention. One board was loose, just enough to pry open. Her fingers worked quickly, pulling the board free, revealing a small space beneath. Inside was an old, leather-bound diary, its cover worn and brittle. She opened it with shaking hands, the pages filled with spidery handwriting. The diary belonged to Samuel, the boy from the newspaper article. His words were disjointed, frantic, and filled with fear. "It comes at night," one entry read. "It likes when you're scared. It wants to keep you forever." Another page described the shadow. "It's not human. It's not alive. It wants to make you like it." Ellie's hands trembled as she read the final entry. "I tried to run, but it always catches you. If you hear it laugh, it's already too late." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. Outside the door, the rattling began again, slow and deliberate. The entity wasn't gone. It was waiting. Ellie sat cross-legged on the floor of her room, the diary open in front of her, the words glaring up at her like a challenge. Samuel's desperate scrawl had laid out what needed to be done, though every fiber of her being screamed to abandon this place, to run and never look back. But she knew running wouldn't save her. The thing in the house wouldn't let her go. She flipped to the final entry again, her lips moving silently as she reread the prayer etched into the page. To banish what is neither alive nor dead, to break its hold, one must stand where it was born. The diary described a ritual, rudimentary but clear. Salt to ward it off, fire to weaken it, words to sever its grip, and the rocking horse. Samuel had written that the creature's presence was tied to that cursed object. Ellie wiped her eyes and stood, determination replacing fear. "All right, you bastard," she muttered, gathering supplies. She raided the kitchen for salt, grabbed candles from the study, and pocketed a box of matches. The house groaned around her as though it could sense her defiance, but she ignored it. The locked room felt colder as she entered, her breath visible in the dim light of her flashlight. She dragged the rocking horse to the center of the room, its hollow creaks echoing like a warning. The photographs on the walls seemed to watch her as she worked, their blank faces a silent audience. Ellie poured a thick circle of salt around the rocking horse, her hands trembling as she whispered the boy's prayer under her breath. She placed candles at 4 points around the circle, lighting each one until their flickering flames cast long, jagged shadows across the room. She took a deep breath and stood back. "Come on," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," the room answered. The candles flickered violently as a gust of freezing air swept through, extinguishing the faint warmth they provided. The walls groaned, the sound splitting into a high-pitched wail. The rocking horse began to sway, first gently, then violently, its movements impossibly fast. And then it appeared. The entity erupted from the shadows, its form shifting and grotesque. Its body was a patchwork of darkness and twisted limbs, its face an ever-changing nightmare of hollow eyes and gaping mouths. It towered over Ellie, radiating a malevolence so thick she could feel it pressing against her chest. The thing roared, a sound that shook the walls and sent cracks spiderwebbing through the plaster. Ellie didn't flinch. She opened the diary to the final page and began reciting the prayer aloud, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. The entity screamed, its form writhing as if her words burned it. It lunged at her, but the salt barrier flared bright, repelling it. Ellie's voice grew louder, the words spilling out in a desperate chant. The room began to shake, the floor buckling beneath her feet. The rocking horse split down the middle with a deafening crack, releasing a burst of ash and smoke. The entity howled, its form unraveling, its glowing eyes dimming as it fought against the ritual's power. Ellie kept going, her voice hoarse but unyielding. The final line left her lips just as the entity let out a final deafening roar. Its body collapsed inward, folding into itself until there was nothing left but a smoldering pile of ash in the center of the circle. The room fell silent. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifting for the first time since she'd entered the house. Ellie sank to the floor, her body shaking with exhaustion and relief. She stared at the pile of ash, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the house remained still, and for the first time in days she felt a flicker of hope. The thing was gone. At least she hoped it was. The silence was deafening. Ellie sat slumped against the wall, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. The air no longer felt heavy, the room no longer cold, but the sense of dread lingered in her bones. The ash from the entity still smoldered faintly in the center of the salt circle. The rocking horse split and broken beside it. She stared at the scene, unable to move, her body trembling with exhaustion. "It's over," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. "It's gone." But the words felt hollow. The house remained quiet as Ellie stepped out of the room, her flashlight beam flickering weakly against the cracked walls. The photographs hanging in the hallway seemed lifeless now, the blank eyes no longer following her. Yet every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet made her flinch. She retreated to her bedroom, throwing her belongings into a bag with frantic energy. She didn't care if she forgot something. She just needed to leave. Now. By the time she zipped the bag shut, dawn was breaking, its pale light filtering through the frost-covered windows. The warm glow should have brought comfort, but instead, it only made the shadows seem sharper, more deliberate. Ellie slung the bag over her shoulder and made her way downstairs. The living room was still, the remnants of the night's terror scattered like evidence at a crime scene. The rocking horse was back in the center of the room, whole again. Ellie froze. She had left it shattered in the locked room upstairs. She knew that for certain. And yet there it was, gently swaying as if someone had just pushed it. There was no breeze. She backed away, her breath quickening, her pulse hammering in her ears. The oppressive silence of the house seemed to press in on her once more, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. A faint sound broke the quiet. A child's laugh, soft and lilting, echoing from the upstairs hall. Ellie's bag slipped from her shoulder and hit the floor with a thud. She didn't look back. She didn't want to know if the sound was following her. The laugh grew louder, echoing through the house as she fumbled with the front door lock. Her hands trembled so violently she thought she might drop the keys. Finally, the door swung open and she stumbled outside into the snow. The cold air hit her like a slap, jolting her back to reality. She turned to look at the house one last time. The windows stared back, dark and empty. But she swore she saw movement in the upstairs window, a shadow that melted away before she could be sure. The laugh echoed again, fainter now, carried on the wind as she climbed into her car. The engine roared to life, and she sped down the driveway, not daring to look in the rearview mirror until the house was completely out of sight. As the forest swallowed the road behind her, Ellie's grip on the steering wheel tightened. The warmth of the rising sun did little to ease the chill in her veins. She knew, deep down, that she had survived. But the house wasn't done. It was never done.